In the face of an unpredictable future, we are all called upon each and every day to think of out-of-the-box ways to tackle challenges to our environment, well-being, or which tennis court you should play at on your next camping holiday. Welcome to the Grand Challenges Podcast, a show about inspiring individuals who are stepping up to these challenges and are here to share stories about their own personal journey towards making our world a better place. I'm your host, Peter Marcus Bach, an urban planner and terrible decision maker with a passion for connecting across expertise and providing you access to knowledge from the cutting edges of science, engineering, technology, and design. My guest today is Dr. Martijn Kuller, an interdisciplinary researcher at the decision-making cluster of the Swiss Federal Institute of Aquatic Science and Technology. Martijn obtained his PhD at Monash University in Australia and has journeyed across the planning and engineering disciplines in search of how we can better support stakeholders in the implementation of nature-based solutions in cities of the future. Today on the show, we uncover the subtleties and ironies of decision-making as it relates to gut feelings and objectives, and how quantitative tools should be designed to better support transitions to climate-resilient cities, both in the global north and south. Detailed information is provided in the show notes over at petermbach.com/podcast. Thank you for joining, and please enjoy the show. Martijn.
Yes.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Peter.
It's going to be a very interesting one, I think, because I had the fortunate opportunity of supervising you. You were my first PhD student, and I think there's always...
I knew this was how you were going to start.
Oh, you knew this was how I was going to start. And this was, yeah, of course. Terrible. I tried to surprise you anyways. You knew this was how I was going to start. Yeah.
And I know you by now.
You know me. Okay. Yeah. Well, we've known each other for quite a few years now. And we've kind of moved in the same directions, first in Australia and now in Switzerland together. And well, you're actually going to be moving a bit further, back to home, I guess, where you were born in the Netherlands. So I think exciting times for you. But yeah, I mean, I'm proud you've done a beautiful PhD, and I think there's a lot of interesting things that we can go into today, especially. And no, I'm looking forward to that.
Me too.
Yeah. I guess one thing I noticed though, with the way you've moved around in your life, is that you started in the Netherlands, then found your way to Australia, then moved to Switzerland, and then for the last year, you've been in Canada doing some research there, and have taken quite a few trips to the US as well. But what I noticed is all these places seem to coincide with one of your hobbies, which is tennis and your fandom of various tennis players. Is that the main reason for your strategic decisions of moving around the world?
Pure coincidence, of course. It was all for professional reasons.
Sure.
But maybe it has subconsciously played a role. Yes, it is true that the places that I've moved to do have that in common. And I have also, I must say, thoroughly enjoyed this aspect of the places that I lived in. Particularly Melbourne, I must say, was really great.
Yeah, Melbourne has a very good coffee culture as well. And I remember we always grab coffees. We always try different coffees. So lots of good memories there.
Absolutely.
Are you any good at tennis, by the way? I can't hit a ball to save my life.
I mean, it's always hard to say that you're good at something. I'm not a beginner, I would say. I'm a medium advanced player. But I mean, for me, it's mostly about the joy of playing and the satisfaction of, well, for me, actually, tennis is very good because I don't like forcing myself to move. So, for example, I hate running, but with tennis, I move naturally because I just want to get that friggin' ball and hit it back, So it's an easy way for me to go all the way. And it's also a really great way for me to completely zone out of my thoughts and really be in the moment. And I think this is, for me, the most effective way to do that. And it helps me, therefore, also really relax. So this is what I really like about tennis. And then I also love watching tennis. And I think doing both, playing it yourself and watching, is very great because you start understanding much more what you see. And then you can also implement what you see in your own game. And so, I was fortunate enough with this moving around to visit some of the greatest tennis tournaments on earth and even play at one of the places where one of these tennis tournaments is played, which is Melbourne Park in Australia, where the Australian Open is played. And I myself have played on these same courts and stadiums as these greatest players on earth. That just feels amazing. And I'm so happy that I had the opportunity to do that for years on end.
Did you win anything?
Of course. I won many things, but only matches, no prizes.
Oh, fair enough.
Yeah.
But hey, it's a good experience. And I've learned the rules from watching a lot of the tennis tournaments every now and then. So Yeah, no, it's interesting how you can learn things just by observing and watching. And I guess you must have applied that to a lot of the things you've done, because when I look at the different aspects you've researched in, it covers anything from, environmental economics, which is where you did your bachelor's in, to environmental management, then moving from there into nature-based solutions, blue-green infrastructures, which was a core topic of your PhD. In Australia, they call it water-sensitive urban design. And now you're a lot more embedded in the decision sciences. So moving away from environmental issues more into the social science aspects that are, of course, just as relevant, I think, in this whole practice. So just for the listeners, I guess what's important to know about this kind of practice is this idea of using nature in cities. How would you define, or what is your favorite term, and how would you define nature-based solutions?
If we talk about the green infrastructures that we find in cities and that we use to adapt to climate change and at the same time to improve livability and biodiversity, I would go for the term blue-green infrastructure. In the work that I'm doing now, I use nature-based solutions most often, but nature-based solutions are a bit more broad term because they are not just referring to urban systems, but they can also refer to any type of systems, fully or semi-engineered system that uses the power of nature to solve our problems that we face with adapting to climate change. So I would say blue-green infrastructure when we talk about cities.
Mm-hmm. I guess to visualize this, you would think of an urban park or a pond or something on the side of the roads that is green and grassy, collecting the storm water that runs off when it rains.
Yeah, it's a system like this. It is also green roofs. I think a lot of people are aware of more and more green roofs emerging in cities around them. So this is a type of system, I think, that also is very popular among people.
Good thought to keep handy, because I'm sure we'll revisit the topic as we go through your journey. But you started in environmental economics, and I was based in an engineering faculty when you came to do your PhD. So that was a whole discipline shift. And now you're in the decision science, which I guess comes back to economics in a certain way, because there's going to be some level of cost involved in that. But you've also looked at flood warning systems or early flood warning systems, as well as more broadly now into how we use models to support planning processes. And then I look at your first paper, and you did a study on an airport. So how did we get there?
Yeah, I guess the story of my life is a little bit similar to the story of my career. I go from one topic to another and from one place to another. And I think this is a reflection of the broad interest that I have, and maybe also the problem that I have with taking decisions or focusing, which is maybe ironic for someone who is working in decision science. But I think there are more ironies to draw from my career. So yeah, I started actually indeed with environmental economics, and then I moved away from that to environmental management for my master in the Netherlands at Wageningen University. This was an interdisciplinary program where we looked at how to manage water, waste, and energy in the urban landscape. And then I had one teacher that really inspired me. Her name is Ljiljana Rodic, and she's from Serbia. And this is another theme. Another theme in my life is Serbian women, because there's also another Serbian woman who had a big impact on my career.
Yes, we definitely know her, and I'm also trying to get her on the show at some point. So it would be nice to hear from her story as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ljiljana Rodic, she was a very inspiring person. And one of the quotes that really stuck with me and that I've taken with me since then is, doing less bad is not doing good. And this refers, in her case, this referred to waste management and the way that we use materials and dispose of them at the end of their life. But I think this is a quote that you can apply to anything, especially in environmental sciences. And it really opened my eyes, because it made me realize how the greenwashing that we often see nowadays is just not good enough. And incremental changes are maybe not suited to the grand challenges that we face and to the transitions that we need for them. And the example that she gave that really made it very clear to me is that if you have a father or a mother who hits her child, and they do this, let's say 10 times a day, and then they say, but I'm improving because now I'm only doing it 8 times a day, does that mean that they're doing good? obviously, most people, I imagine, would say no, because you shouldn't hit your child at all. And this is the same in environmental problems. If you have an airplane that flies 25% more efficiently, it's usually advertised as this is a very green airplane. But no, the airplane's not green. It's just a little bit less black. And I think this is a thought that we should always keep in mind when we think about environmental problems and how we really need to change things.
So we would need more revolutionary solutions, and rather than just doing less of what we're doing now.
Exactly. And this is also one thing that I've read in a paper recently, is when it comes to the problems that we're looking at, which is urban transitions and transitioning to better water management, is that we need to really change our perspective completely rather than trying to optimize what we are doing at the moment. And this changing completely is, for example, moving to green systems to manage our water rather than making the gray systems that we have work better for us. So yeah, I think this is one thing that really stuck with me throughout my career. She was also the reason that I went to Australia, because she had contacts in Adelaide with an organization called Zero Waste SA. And this was a government agency that don't exist anymore, where I worked for a year. And after that, I came to Melbourne and do my PhD there, which was never my intention, but it ended up like that. And I'm very happy it went like that.
And that's how we crossed paths.
And that's where we met.
You were part of an interdisciplinary research program, so straight into multidisciplinary work. And I believe it was also working in countries of the Global South.
Yes.
I think particularly Indonesia was your focal area.
Correct, yeah. We were with a group of 14 students, 14 PhD students. We all had, as a theme, we had water, urban water, and we came from different disciplines, and we also were enrolled in different faculties. So half of us were enrolled in engineering, like myself, and then the other half was enrolled in social sciences. But also on a personal level, we were working together with both engineering and social sciences. And many of us looked at Indonesia as a case study because we had a lot of contacts in Indonesia and a great project that we were doing with them. And I was one of these students also looking at Indonesia.
And the work that you did as part of your PhD research with Indonesia as a case study really delved into two different yet synergistic themes, one being around water-sensitive urban design, this whole nature and cities aspects, but then the second part being the planning support element. How do we actually support their planning? What drove you to choose that particular aspect to couple with this idea of nature and cities? Because engineers would look at the technologies and they might look at, how people might perceive recycling water from these systems or capturing water to reuse, but you chose planning support.
Yeah, so for me, it was more natural also to choose planning support. That's probably the main reason, because that was more my interest. I was more interested in urban planning rather than engineering, and I also don't have a background in engineering. And this is also where Ana Deletic, is the other Serbian woman who was my professor at Monash University in Melbourne, came in, and she herself also was convinced that in order to take a step further in this sustainable urban water management, as the overarching theme was, is to focus not only on engineering solutions. And this actually brings me back to another quote of my teacher, Lilana Rodic, who used to say, you can ask an engineer anything and they will give you a solution, but it's about asking the right things. So an engineer can solve any problem that you have, but are they solving the right problems? And I think this is then what Ana Deletic also connected to when she said, we need to look more also at how to implement things rather than just looking at how to best do things, because we have done a lot of engineering for decades and we basically know a lot and we know how things should work, but they don't. And why do they not? And that's not an engineering question. It is a planning question and it's a social science question. And so this is why I, and me as let's say a spatial geek, was mostly interested in this planning question. And so this is why I went into planning support, because the idea is that with the right support, we can make this transition towards green cities better and basically take all the complexity that is involved in that and make it comprehensible to the people who are taking the decisions and implement it.
It's interesting that you put the way you put it, calling yourself a spatial geek. We often talk about computer geeks, we often talk about gaming geeks, but a spatial geek, how would you define that?
So when I was very young. Well, actually, my first fascination was with astronomy, but I think I moved away from that because I don't think I have the brain for that. So then I got a fascination for maps, essentially. And there is a book in the Netherlands called the Bos Atlas, which is an atlas that is used by all the schools in the Netherlands. And when I was very young, I used to spend hours and hours on the weekends in my bed just looking at the atlas and looking at the maps. And the atlas doesn't just have geographical maps, but it also has statistical maps showing different statistics divided, or like how they vary over the world. And using all these maps, I was basically traveling the world in my mind. I was imagining how places looked and imagining how it would be to be there. And so I guess this is why I call myself a spatial geek. And I'm very happy that I have been able to put that part also in my work and now actually work with maps and create maps myself, which is very satisfying to do.
Very practical using geographic information systems nowadays because we can create our own maps. And I guess this is where you have a playground available to you all of a sudden to relive your childhood or to create something that maybe, one day other children can enjoy in the comfort of their own homes as well. And so you've been able to merge your passion for maps using geographic information sciences or GIS systems with a lot of these key issues that you perceive around asking the right questions or solving the right questions as engineers with a potential solution that we can use against the challenges that we face, which is nature and cities, or water-sensitive urban design. How did you then balance all these different elements going through your PhD, which in many cases is often the first real opportunity you get to do true independent research thinking and just growth as a researcher, or as someone who wants to solve key problems and make new knowledge?
I guess I started out from the notion of the complexity that is involved in the transition towards green cities. There are many aspects that we need to take into consideration. And because they are very different, for example, we have to take into consideration biodiversity. We have to take into consideration hydrology, but also human aspects, like how are these systems going to sit with their environment in the urban environment. And because all these things are very different from each other, it's very hard to take them all into consideration. I started out with the notion of complexity theory in my PhD, because complexity theory, for the listener, is this grand theory that tries to explain emergent behavior out of interactions between agents that are very simple. But if you have a large number of these agents that have very simple interaction, you get this very complex emergent behavior out of it. And what I started trying out in my PhD is to use this complexity theory that is applicable to many fields, including ecology, including physics, including chemistry, to use this actually in this urban planning task, capturing the complexity of this urban planning task. And after a while, I got stuck. The way forward for me was to slightly change path. I moved away from complexity theory, even though I still think that it has great potential to help us explain some of the processes that we see, especially when it comes to transitions. But I embarked on a different path that led me to using spatial data. Then I moved to a technique called GIS MCDA, or GIS Geoinformation Systems, MCDA Multi-Criteria Decision Analysis, which essentially comes down to just combining a bunch of different data sets and human preferences, such as those from stakeholders, and making sense out of that. So there are all these different aspects that are important when we think about planning of these green infrastructures in our cities, aspects related to economics, aspects related to the urban landscape, aspects related to hydrology.
Social aspects as well, cultural aspects.
Exactly.
Yep.
So if we have data, if we have maps that represent these different aspects, and we overlay these maps in a clever way, we can then see emerging patterns that tell us what we should do and how we should do it. That is, in a nutshell, what GIS MCDA does. And for me, it was great because it meant playing around with lots of maps.
Your childhood dream.
Exactly. And now this might sound very simple and simplistic, but of course, when you go down in the details, it is a little bit more complex than that. But the underlying notion is something called value-focused thinking. So when we have to take complex decisions, what people tend to do is focus very much on the options that we have. Like if you are planning your holiday, which is the example that I like to go to because it's a spatial problem in a way, you usually start thinking about the different options that you have. And then you try and see which option you want based on your gut feeling. Actually, the same thing happens when we plan these systems in our cities in many cases. This is something that I started realizing when talking to practitioners, mostly in Melbourne. They generally just went with their gut feeling. This is, as you might imagine, not ideal.
And actually, this is a very interesting point because I would have thought this sounds very systematic as a decision-making process, but how do you use this to then convince people with 20, 30 years of experience of doing something, having that inkling or that gut feeling that you've just mentioned, driving their decisions, and all of a sudden now they have to change or they have to hold back on that decision making? It's a real resistance that they would have to fight. How do you then use this to convince them?
Honestly, I've found that many people were aware of the limitations of their decision-making processes and that they actually acknowledged that what they were doing wasn't optimal, but they also indicated that they were quite overwhelmed with all the aspects that were relevant, and therefore they usually focused on one particular aspect, like cost. For example, they just implement green infrastructure the way that it would be cheapest.
Okay.
But they did usually realize that this was not ideal, and providing them with an option that does take the complexity into consideration without them having to think everything through didn't take much convincing,
okay,
I must say. So the change in mindset basically that we do with this GIS MCDA is that we start from the notion of values rather than the notion of options or alternatives. So instead of thinking about, okay, I can go to France, I can go to China, and I can go to Australia, you think, okay, but what do I want from my holiday? Do I want to relax? Do I want to discover? Do I want it to be cheap? How much money do I have? So these are what we call objectives that we want out of the holiday in this case.
I guess weather is one of them as well, if I've understood you correctly. Do I want to be in a cold country, or do I want to escape the winter to some sunny beach?
Exactly. Yeah. So these would be what we call objectives. And if you start from the objectives rather than from the alternatives, China, France, you might actually come up with alternatives that you hadn't thought of before.
Interesting.
And at the same time, it gives you a tool to evaluate the alternatives that you have. If you know that you are looking for sun and you're looking for exploration, then Australia scores pretty well on both of those aspects. And for example, Norway scores very well on exploration, but not so well on weather. So this gives you then a very systematic tool to evaluate different alternatives that you have and even come up with alternatives that you didn't think of before.
This reminds me of a particular article. No, it was a book that I was looking into, and it was about how to travel more economically or more efficiently. We'll put a link in the show notes. That I'm blanking on the title at the moment, but it was a recent release. And it also suggested this approach of not trying to be too rigid in your initial decision of where to go, but rather, if it's about making cost-effective travel and having huge enjoyment, starting with this very approach, looking at objectives.
Yeah.
And so, I guess it's something I can really relate to. And in a way, when you start from that angle, it appears, the way you're describing it, that cost then starts, which is often a big decision factor in many engineering projects. Cost then somehow falls by the wayside. It becomes less, it's less in the forefront and takes a more backseat alongside all the other kinds of objectives you would want to optimize for or maximize.
It can in many cases, yes. But if anything, it allows you to also see the trade-offs that you have to make. You can very clearly then start seeing, okay, well, for a bit more money, I can get these other options. But it does mean that I have to pay more money for it. And it makes these what we call trade-offs between the different objectives. Money versus sun, for example. If you're in a northern place, it'll cost you more money to go to the sun. So that's a trade-off between traveling far and saving money. And it is very interesting that the outcome of a process like that is usually very different from what you expect in the beginning when you just look at the alternatives. I did an experiment with using in a class that I gave with 7 students, and we went very quickly, like in probably an hour, we went through a whole decision-making process. And I used this same example of where you want to go on holiday. And we came up with a few alternatives, 3 alternatives, I think. And one of them was staying home. are doing a staycation.
I guess that's also an option, yes.
Which is an option that most people don't think about when they plan their holiday. And I told them to include this option. And they were very reluctant to do so because they were convinced that this was not what they would choose. But you can feel it coming, of course, after going through this process where they come up with the objectives that they had with their holiday. So I didn't force them into any specific objectives. And scoring the objectives in terms of the relative importance. So costs was one objective. Travel time, I think, and environmental impact also was an objective that they came up with. And then when they scored how important these objectives were to them, turned out that staying home was actually their best option. And they were very disappointed by that, which I think is very funny because it means that the option that they actually prefer, their gut tells them to be disappointed, but it's actually the option that meets their objectives best.
Systematically saying, yes, I guess if you stay at home, your cost is next to nothing other than just your day-to-day costs. You have very little environmental impact with carbon footprint and travel time. Well, you're not traveling because you're sitting on your couch, or I guess you're going to your garden. Or maybe you have to set up a tent outside in the garden if that's what your style of holiday is. But it's interesting, and so in a way, I
think it might have helped that they were in Montreal and there's a lot of cool stuff to do there. So it was a good option. Also, it's not the same everywhere. I think.
I suppose that's when other objectives like the feeling of the location, the general entertainment options or exploration options around the area would also come into play as a result of that. So, but conveniently, you had the chance to show them this, and it's fascinating to see how when you're doing this systematically, that gut feeling starts to really build up a resistance, and that disappointment, I guess would that be the crux of what you're trying to get to in a way? You getting the option that you didn't think you would choose and learning something from that. Is there something to be learned from this kind of process?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you show people that if they actually listen to the objectives that they have, which is what you should do, I think that's an easy argument to make, that then you come up with solutions that you hadn't thought would be the best, or even that you didn't think of at all. And I think when it comes to decision making, for like public decision making, the resistance might be a little bit less because it's not about a personal decision, and it also makes it easier to then justify the decision that you've taken to the people you're taking this decision for, whether it be your boss or the people who live in your municipality or whatever type of decision maker you are. So I think in the end, people are quite happy with this type of decision approach. And this is also what I found when using this approach with the people.
And so you have different roles that people have in the decision-making process, and the decision in the public realm it really involves multiple decision makers. And so how do you navigate that now? We've had the holiday example, but if we now apply this to water-sensitive urban design, climate change adaptation, trying to solve our grand challenges, it becomes a lot more complicated because all of a sudden now you're going to have conflict of interest and clashes, right?
Absolutely. And also I think it's not a holy grail, of course. I like to say that I work on decision support systems rather than decision-making models, because these tools and models are around to help us understand the decision that we're taking. But we are, in the end, still the ones that have to take the decision. And sometimes the decision is political and not practical. I think still what the added value of this systematic way of looking at a decision is that it makes the trade-offs very clear. So it's very clear that an objective that one person might have, for example, one person might just want a greener street, that it is in conflict with an objective that another person might have. Like, for example, having more parking, which is an example that I know from Melbourne. Implementing green infrastructure in Melbourne in some areas has huge resistance because these areas are already green. It's usually the more wealthy areas, and people don't want to give up space from parking. Once, someone from the municipality in Melbourne told me that people on purpose park their cars in rain gardens, which is a type of green infrastructure, because they want it to fail, because it took away their parking spot on the street. So this is a very clear example of these kind of trade-offs. And I think, if anything, anything, this type of decision analysis can help you make these trade-offs very clear and then help you start that discussion between different stakeholders.
And that discussion then hopefully leads to, I guess, a mutual understanding or learning from each other's disciplines. The person in charge of parking versus the person in charge of, say, drainage, because these systems can aid drainage as well. They will have a much better idea of how to then coordinate efforts as a result of deciding to implement one of these green infrastructures.
Exactly. And they can also then be held accountable for the decisions that they've made because they've consciously chosen one objective over another or put more emphasis on one aspect than on another.
But apart from accountability, it's also the decision can be explained. It can be, I guess the word we're looking for here, it can be rationalized. It can be reasoned with. You can see how it emerged.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think the great value of MCDA, as we call it, is that we can take into consideration hard facts, which in my case is represented by maps because I'm looking at spatial multi-criteria decision analysis, and opinions or preferences. So this type of modeling, if you want to call that, takes both these objective and subjective aspects into consideration and then makes it clear how they play out in your final decision.
And you've used this mostly in the green infrastructure space, but I believe you've also looked at how this works in a rather, related but more broader field, which is around floods and flood warning systems. Can you tell me a bit about how that differs to what you've sort of been doing and I think have gone back to doing now as well?
Yeah, so that was a very interesting project that we did here at EWAG in Zurich. We were part of a European project which was called FANFA. And this project, we were working together with an institute in Sweden, in Italy and in Spain, and with stakeholders from 17 countries in West Africa to implement a flood forecast system.
What does that involve? So it's a system that can tell you when a flood's going to arrive or how big how severe the flood is going to be?
Yeah, so a big problem, especially in the global south, is that there are no proper systems in place to warn people before a natural disaster is going to come. And floods are the most common and the most devastating natural disasters. So the problem in this case was our area of study was West Africa, and there was no proper system in place to warn people that a flood was upcoming so that people could anticipate that. And it's not just about saving lives, but it's also about bringing your livestock in safety, for example, if you know that a certain area is going to be flooded. So the aim of this research project was to work together with the stakeholders from 17 West African countries to develop a flood forecasting system and a warning system that would help them to first forecast the flood properly using this scarce data that they have in that part of the world, and then to communicate this in an effective way to the population. This was a hugely interesting and at the same time, of course, challenging task because we needed the system to meet different objectives. It needed to be easy to use and fast enough, but also accurate enough, because you don't want to have false warnings all the time, because then at some point people will start ignoring them.
So the boy cried wolf kind of situation.
Exactly that, yes. So the other aspect that MCDA is really good at is bringing together different stakeholders to start understanding the problem together, right? So this is also, we call it co-development of this flood forecast system. So this took place in several workshops that we had in different places in West Africa, bringing together all these stakeholders, which was super interesting and a lot of fun and also a lot of challenges to overcome in that process. So we came up with the optimal, let's say, forecast and warning system for this part of the world, according to the people who are going to use it. And hopefully this can help them into the future.
And so that was a 2-year project?
The project itself was, I think, 4 or 5 years in the end. Also, COVID hit in the middle, so it complicated everything a little bit. But I was involved only for 1.5 years, 2 years. I came in the middle.
Okay, so yeah, it's quite an involved process to really implement this kind of decision-making framework to help with the design of a warning system as such.
Yes, and we were also designing the warning system as we went. So the decision-making and the actual development of the end product, in this case, the warning system, happened simultaneously.
And I guess what's interesting now is if you just look at the different titles of the kind of works you produce, you would think this was a sidestep, but in fact, it's more like adding to what is now or what has now become your core. Even though you've moved back into the green infrastructure space quite actively, you actually want to focus a lot more now on the quality of these kinds of systems and how we can use them or improve upon the design of these systems and their use in engaging with stakeholders. And this is now your current ongoing project titled Move NBS.
Correct, yes. What I noticed when working with these type of systems, but also being familiar a little bit with the more engineering type models like hydrological modeling, is that when we talk about these kind of planning support systems, as we call them, we usually just take whatever they do for granted, and nobody, or at least the developers of them, do that. And they don't discuss how these systems perform, if what they tell you is actually useful, if it makes any sense, and if we should therefore be using these systems or not. And so what I'm now looking at is to change this. I'm looking at ways to evaluate the quality of these planning support systems. And this quality is much broader than what we would think of when you talk about engineering type of models. An engineering type of model is usually judged based on the goodness of fit with reality.
So how good the output or the prediction, if you want to call it that, of the model is compared to the data that we calibrated the model with. So if we know it can reproduce history quite accurately, then it's a good model.
Exactly.
That's the assumption.
Yeah.
Which is now becoming a very a big trap, I guess, to fall into. And it's been a long-term fallacy as well, thinking that reproducing history is going to give us an accurate prediction of the future, which is uncertain. Of course,
with climate change, the future doesn't work the same as the past. So, but in general, you would look at, does the model represent reality properly? But when you talk about these planning support systems, they usually don't represent reality, but they give you an abstract type of information. In the case of the model that I work most with, which is the one that I developed during my PhD, I called the model SANTO, which stands for Spatial Suitability Analysis Tool. It produces suitability maps, which are maps that indicate with a color coding from green to red how suitable a place is for the implementation of a certain green infrastructure. Now you can go out and walk through your city and measure this suitability. So how do you then evaluate the quality of the model? So there are a lot of other aspects that you need to look at. And one of the most important ones is how useful is the model to inform the decision-making process? And how much better are the decisions that we're making with the model compared to without the model?
And so it's really touching upon the more subjective aspects of the model, for one, given it's based on a lot of preferences, but then also on more the actual use of it in terms of we're not really predicting with it. We're trying to, I guess, test scenarios, different decisions or different opinions of different groups of stakeholders. And I guess what is the best way of proceeding to test this?
Yeah, exactly. So it's also looking at, how much does this model help the communication between stakeholders? Or just a simple thing like how accessible is a model? Can you find it? Can you download it for free? Can you then understand how it works? How long does it take you to learn to use the model? All these kind of aspects start playing a role, because what we see a lot is that we like to, especially in the academic community, we like to develop things. We like to develop new models, new tools, and they usually end up in the bottom of a shelf. And there can be multiple reasons for that. And a lot of them include this, for example, accessibility. So we need to look at a very broad spectrum of quality indicators if we want to understand the performance of these kind of tools.
And I guess whether the model is asking the right questions that we need to answer, just to come back to your quote about the engineers.
Yes, and that is a very good one. And that is probably the critical one, because if the model doesn't answer the questions that the user asks, like an urban planner in this case, then they're not going to use it. What I've found is that in most fields, especially related to environmental modeling, which is what I focused on the most, these questions of how good is the model are not being asked and they're not being answered.
Do you think we have too much, or we put too much faith in such tools, assuming they will make our lives easier and remove our need to think actively about the problem?
I think this can definitely be a risk, and it all depends on how a model is used. If a model is used to give an answer, then this is a risk that you run, because you can just go with the answer and run with it. If the model is used as I think they should be used to support the process of taking a decision, then I think they can really add value. How it is at the moment is I think that most of these models are not being used. And I think that is the biggest problem that we're facing now, because on the one hand, we know that we need to find ways to include this complexity into our decision making. And we also know that there are good techniques to do so, as I talked about before, but we're not really using these techniques in most practice. And so essentially, I guess the question that I'm trying to answer is, how can we change that?
And I'm looking forward to seeing how you progress along that road and what kinds of answers you may offer, given that I think modeling methodology is often overlooked. People very easily jump into the modeling without taking a step back and actually thinking about the philosophy behind it before they even begin. And I think this is so crucial, because then it starts leading to the abuse and use of models to get the answer you want as a result. And again, it leads to this danger of not answering the right questions. And that's because we're too focused on the model as a shiny tool rather than the actual problem. And I think this is where you've explained with the multi-criteria decision analysis that starting with value-focused thinking and starting with the objectives, it really reflects upon the modeling methodology as well, whether you use a computer model or any kind of, framework to approach a problem. So very, very fascinating and interesting to hear your insights about that. I'd love to ask you a few questions that I asked to guests on the show and hear what your thoughts are and what advice you can offer to young aspiring researchers who want to go into this field, or especially into an interdisciplinary kind of career track, which you've faced a lot in the different places that you've been to. What does inspire you to be interdisciplinary, to do the things you've already mentioned, the maps that I think have driven you a lot, and the one inspiration in your teacher that has given you some really fascinating advice and in a way drove you to come to Australia, which was, I guess, your first step out of Europe and your first step out of where you grew up, right?
Yeah.
What are some other day-to-day things that you think about that really inspire you to do what you do and to keep going as well? Because sometimes the going gets tough when dealing with complexity.
So I don't really have a glossy magazine cover answer to that. I don't go around inspired every day. And as they say, it's 90% perspiration, 10% inspiration. I think that is very true. But of course, I do get inspired, and I have moments that keep me going and help me see the purpose of the things that I'm doing. And most of those moments appear when I am in conversation with people. I really enjoy, for example, going to conferences and talking about people's work, talking about my work, and also talking to just random people like family, could be friends, trying to explain what I'm doing. For all people, work can be sometimes a drag. But then when I explain what I do to a friend, I often get a super enthusiastic response. And I'm like, whoa, what you're doing is so cool. I'm like, yeah, actually, when I take a step back, it is kind of cool. And it is what I've always wanted to work on. So those moments really inspire me. Also, places inspire me. And this is what I really liked about the opportunities that I've had so far. Living in different places and going and meeting different people really keeps my mind fresh and gives me different perspectives. And also just gives me an idea of how the things that we're working on, like urban spaces, how they can differ around the world. And what I love to do when I'm in a new place is just take the end of a tram line, take the end of a metro line, and just look at what it looks like there. That way you usually get very unexpected but really cool experiences and really get to know a place in a way that going to tourist sites you wouldn't. And yeah, this is something that also really, really has inspired me. And then finally also just the thought that I could make a tiny, even if it's unmeasurably small difference to the course of the future and the way that we live is something that keeps me going.
Yeah, it's a lovely picture you paint, especially with the travel. I think when I go to a new place, the first thing I look for is coffee. I know you like coffee too.
is also number 2 on my list, I would say.
Yeah. What's the best coffee in the world at the moment?
You mean type or place?
Place. City with the best coffee.
I would have to say Melbourne. I haven't visited all places in the world, but Melbourne must be up there.
I think Melbourne's pretty high up there. I heard Berlin's good, but I haven't gotten the chance to try the coffee there yet.
I think Vienna is gets mentioned when it's about coffee. I guess they have a big coffee culture. Of course, Italy, where I tend to go quite often, has good coffee.
Yep.
And they are also very peculiar about their coffee. When you drink cappuccino after 11,
that is true.
They look at you with disdain. But I think Melbourne would be the best place for me.
Melbourne has set some kind of standard with the coffee. I kind of noticed that it's been very hipster there, and they have their own special kind of drinks that they make. And if you go somewhere and you see a flat white on the menu, you're like, okay, there's serious barista vibes.
This place is a good place.
There's serious barista vibes going on,
yeah.
Or a magic, for that fact. For the listeners who don't know, if you ever in Melbourne do order a magic, try and find a cafe that sells a magic. It's a double ristretto 3/4 latte, and it's actually a very different taste to what your normal cappuccino or latte would taste like. So
they sometimes go too far in Melbourne as well. Like you have the avocado latte. I don't know if you don't know it.
No.
Google it.
Yeah,
it is basically combining the two most hipster things from Melbourne together. And honestly, I haven't tried, but I don't think it's great.
We'll try and find a nice article on it and put it in the show notes so you can check it out as well. Avocado latte, I haven't tried it myself. We have the chai lattes too, but we digress. But so you mentioned your teacher who's had a very strong effect on you. She got you to leave the Netherlands and come to Australia. You also mentioned the atlas that really inspired you as a child and somehow gave you that pathway from astronomy into spatial planning and being a spatial geek. Is there anything else you can think of that has completely changed the course of your career or mindset?
I think the most important things you've mentioned that have really changed the course of my career and my mindset. I think the conversations that I've had with people that I've met in the different places I lived have really changed my mindset and also the ideas that people give me. Like sometimes the ideas are very concrete, like with a bit of recency bias. I could say there's this work from David Hume, philosopher from the 18th century, that was given to me by a friend that I made in Canada, which is currently really changing my perspective on science and on the way that we think and understand things. I have a few papers that really changed my perspective and that got me into, or that gave me my curiosity to this grand theory of complexity science, which are a couple of papers published in Nature and Science by a researcher called Martin Scheffer, who was actually, probably still is, professor at the university where I started and who won also a very famous prize in the Netherlands with his work, which inspired me both by the elegance with which they were written. They were discussing a very complex topic, but it was written in a way that was so easy to understand. And it still amazes me when I read this today that you can write something so clearly, even though it is so complicated, but I'm sure that, anyone could understand. So this is something that both in terms of just writing and also in terms of its content really inspired me. Another book, which is huge recency bias because I just finished it, is a book by Rutger Bregman, which is a Dutch philosopher. In English, it's called Humankind, which is very different from the Dutch title, actually. Okay. But this book basically busts the myth that we perpetuate that people are fundamentally bad and untrustworthy. And it does this with a ton of examples. And it really opened my eyes. If I can give you maybe a couple of examples to make it clear. So,
and go ahead to restore my faith in humanity.
Yes.
No, sounds very fascinating. Go ahead.
So one of the stories that actually I think is even taught in many psychology courses is this phenomenon that is called the bystander effect, which basically says that if there are multiple people around and something happens to someone, we tend to not take action to help this person because there are so many people around and we think someone else will do it for us. This is often presented as a fact, as an actual thing that exists, but it doesn't. And there are many examples that have led to this belief that it exists. For example, this story of a woman, I think her name was Kathy, in New York, who was murdered in the evening on the street while there was apparently 30 people watching it happen from their apartment. and nobody calling the police or nobody coming to help her. This is a story that was published in the New York Times, but it's actually based on fake facts, because what actually happened is that there were, in the first minute of the lady crying, there were, I don't know, something like 30 people calling the police. But the police didn't respond to the calls because they just thought, it's just a drunk lady on the street and this happens all the time. Coming back to the wolf
Oh no, the boy
story.
who cried wolf. Yeah.
Exactly. And so what happened is that they made this story to the New York Times, and this became this sort of like example of big city indifference, people not caring about each other. But what happened in reality was completely the opposite of the story, because actually someone went out to try and scare away her attacker. Someone else tried to help her survive. Many people called the police. And so because we tell each other these stories...
And it's also reported in the media.
And it's reported in the media.
Very frequently we see.
Yeah, we believe it's true. And another example is a very famous experiment, which is called I think it's called the prison experiment. And there's even I think there are maybe several movies made about this. It's this experiment where the professor gives some of his students a role of being a prison guard and other students the role of a prisoner. And then the idea is to see how this social structure evolves. And the hypothesis that the professor wanted to prove is that, again, deep down inside, we're all horrible and we are going to be very sadistic, or the prison guards will start becoming very sadistic towards the prisoners. And this is also how it has been published, and it is perpetuated in books about psychology. But again, what really happened, because later on there was an interview done with all of the participants in this experiment, and what they told is that this is completely not what happened in reality. There wasn't any sadism going on. And in fact, the professor had to constantly intervene to make sadism happen, but it didn't. Because in reality, people were just drinking coffee with each other.
Talk about interfering with your own data.
Yes, and even though this is known and published, people still perpetuate the story about this turning into an orgy of violence, basically. And I'm this huge fan of some channels on YouTube that talk about big scientific questions. And once I saw an episode of one of my favorite channels on this particular experiment, and he was also, again, perpetuating this story of violence. After that, that really made me think the things that we take to us from the sources that we trust, they can be actually so biased and they can be completely wrong. Yeah, this book gives like loads and loads of these kind of examples and also other scientific background of why people are in principle actually good instead of bad. So I can recommend everyone to read it because it will really change your view on humanity.
So the book is called Humankind by, well, how do you say his name again?
Rutger Bregman.
Rutger Bregman.
Yes.
Okay. And what's the Dutch title? Because you said it doesn't sound anything like the English title.
So the Dutch title is De meeste mensen deugen, which would translate to something like most people are good or most people are okay.
Okay. We'll definitely have to put a link and some info about that in the show notes, because it seems like a lot of myths around it are being debunked, and with a lot of data and I guess accounts from the people involved to back that up as well. And I guess in relation to a lot of the stuff that we've discussed so far, you can really see how looking at it in a systematic way and with a lot of evidence versus just trusting your gut the minute you read about something, whether it's reported by the media or by an eyewitness account or by someone else just passing on the information. So
yeah, and your gut is also sort of molded in a way to believe these kind of things because that's the stories that we tell each other, whether they're wrong or not.
Some level of sensationalism as well involved that I guess further agitates it or further encourages it too.
Yeah.
So you've been delving with lots of disciplines. You've been reading these very interesting books, and I guess one aspect is time management. What tips and strategies can you offer in terms of time management? How do you maintain a balance between your professional life and personal time? I guess there's some overlaps there.
So time management, let me just start with a disclaimer. I'm not very good at it, but I think time management requires planning and it requires like good decision making, which is ironic in my case because I should be very good at that, focusing a lot on urban planning and on decision analysis. But turns out that I'm pretty bad at these things myself.
I think you're pretty good at what you do.
Well, but I'm not very good at planning my time properly. And I often take on too much, as I think is very recognizable to many academics. It's hard to say no to projects because so many things are interesting. I love working with different people on different projects, but you can only do so much, right? So yeah, the decision making comes in then because you have to decide what you want to do and what you do not want to do.
So do you do a personal multi-criteria decision analysis of what projects you want to take on? Or do you use your gut?
It's interesting you say so. I had a pretty big decision to make recently. And one of the approaches I took was the approach that I preach. And it's probably not the one that led me to my final decision, to be honest. But I guess decision making may be more hard for people that work in decision making because they know how many aspects there are to a decision and they know they shouldn't just follow their gut. So in a way, you complicate it for yourself.
It's nice to know because when I supervised you with Anna, one of the things I kept telling you is do as I say, not as I do, which I think is sage advice from many other people. Not that I don't claim that advice for myself because I'm frantic and scattered at times as well. So
yeah, it's a good, and it's often perceived as a part of your credibility, that you actually practice what you preach. It's the same with environmental issues. If you go around flying around the world to conferences about environmental topics, are you being hypocritical? And yeah, there's an argument to make for that. But at the same time, what you say can be as valid no matter your own behavior. So in the case of decision-making and planning, that's definitely the case for me.
And so for time management, I guess it's learning to decide what to take on and actually what to say no to.
Exactly. And also just to accept that there's only so many things you can do in a day and you have to stop at some point doing them, even if you haven't finished them. And the way that I deal with the stress that maybe too much work provides me is coming back to what we started with, is the tennis. Like the way that I can really completely zone out and forget about all the tasks that I have on my list is just to go step on the court. And I am just completely one with the racket and the ball. And that's all I think about. And that really greatly helps me relax. One other small thing that I've done is that I've gotten rid of my social media, which I noticed were really distracting me and fragmenting my attention. And I decided just one day that the advantage that it was giving me wasn't weighing up to this fragmentation of my attention and my concentration. I just got rid of them. And this has helped me focus better. I must say, it is still hard, and I think somehow social media have damaged my brain because I still look for distractions. So now, even though I don't have social media, I just find my own distractions by randomly Googling stuff or looking at the news or whatever.
I mean, maybe you might learn some new facts or fake facts to test some of the readings you've
Definitely
been doing.
True. Definitely. And another thing that distracts me a lot is working right underneath the flight path, the main flight path of Zurich Airport, because I can see the planes taking off. And there's this great app where you can track all the flights and you can see what plane they are, where they're going, where they're coming from. So every time I see a plane take off, and this happens a lot, I have to know which one it is.
It's quite a high frequency at Zurich Airport.
It is, yeah.
Something that relates to a lot of the traveling that you do enjoy. So I guess distraction is also part of the wanting to maybe go somewhere and then try the coffee and then take the tram or the metro to the end of the line.
True, yeah.
Yeah, now that would be tough. But on that note, what was one of the most challenging situations that you have ever faced in your career to date, and how did you overcome it?
So I've talked about the change that I had to make in the focus of my PhD, which was very challenging. But another more acute, challenging event that happened was actually in Indonesia. So I was in Indonesia gathering data together with a bunch of my PhD colleagues and friends, and also some of the principal investigators, the main scientists, let's say, on this project. Personally, I was there to gather data for running the model that I was developing. So this was spatial data sets, essentially. And at the same time, I was looking to interview practitioners who were supposed to use these kind of models to get their perspective. Now, gathering this data in an Indonesian context was completely different to the context of Australia, where I had done this work before, in the sense that the culture just works differently. So in order to access this type of spatial data, you needed to have access to the right person in the right department. And to get this access, you needed to write a letter a certain time in advance, and then you needed to talk to person X, and then person X would give it to person Y. It was a process. And if you're not familiar with this process, you're not going to get to the result that you need. And we hadn't properly prepared for this process. So we went to Indonesia and data wasn't coming to us.
It was your first experience working in a country of the global south?
Yeah, it was my first experience. And at the same time, I wanted to interview people, but the same process preceded getting access to these people. And so nothing was happening. And nothing was happening for 1 week, and then nothing was happening for another week. But of course, my PhD clock was ticking. And at the same time, also lots and lots of money was being spent because we were staying in hotels and we had to live. And we weren't basically doing anything. We were just sitting in our hotel room. At some point, we started becoming very nervous about this situation. And we started talking to our partners who were there working with us and trying to help us get access to the right people and the right data. And they started causing some friction. And I mean, long story short, it ended up in us having to abort the project and immediately leave the country because our stay in that country was related to us doing the project. So we had to leave the country, but we had given away our passports to the university that we were working with, and they refused to give us our passports back because of the friction. So basically we were in our hotels in Indonesia, and we did not know where to go or what to do.
To put it simply, that sounds like a scary experience, and that when you're not sure when you're going to board the next plane out or can even do anything at all there, you're just stuck in a foreign country that you're not as familiar with. I guess you would have familiarized yourself with basic things.
Yeah, but I mean, from my side, I had no clue. Like, I'd never worked in a country like that. And I wasn't very much involved in building these relationships either. So my preparation was suboptimal, to be euphemistic. But of course, you learn from these kind of experiences, and I would never take the same approach next time when I do a project. Yeah, in that very moment, it was quite stressful, and it ended well. In the end, after some negotiation, we managed to get our passports back, but it had to escalate to the highest level, let's say.
And I guess it's a situation where you really feel helpless because you don't have control over the situation. You don't have the background knowledge of what has happened to date to be able to act upon it. And so I guess you're reliant on an external force to help you out of the situation. So how do you digest that personally?
It's exactly as you say. You feel very helpless and powerless because you're not in charge of what's going to happen. You don't have any leverage, and you depend on other people to get you out of that situation. So I guess it feels a little bit like when it's maybe a strange parallel to draw, but like when I'm watching a tennis match between someone that I really support and I want to win, I get very nervous. Whereas when I'm in a tennis match myself, I don't feel the same type of nerves because I'm in charge and it's up to me whether I win or lose that match. But when you're just watching on television or in the stadium, you're not in charge. And so, yeah, it was this same kind of powerlessness that I felt in that moment.
And so how do you cope with this kind of feeling, especially when you're at the height of that powerlessness, that fear that you might have of what's going to happen next, that uncertainty? How do you process? I mean, how do you cope with this feeling and then overcome it?
I was lucky that I was not alone. So I was there with my friends, PhD colleagues. We were all in it together. So we could talk to each other about it. We could help each other overcome our anxiety in that moment. And we knew that we weren't there alone in whatever might happen in the future. So that greatly helped. And I think in general, that can help overcoming these kind of situations, knowing that you're not the only one who's ever faced this kind of situation, that you can talk to people and share your experience. I think this is probably the most important thing.
Strength in numbers. And I guess never forget you have people around and working together, teamwork makes the dream work.
Yeah, and you're not the only one to experience what you're experiencing. I always find this a very great relief.
That is very true. I believe there would be many stories in the world of people going through similar kinds of experiences, or at least similar kind of emotions and feelings. And the key is to basically find examples of this and learn from it as well and grow strength from it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so you say you aborted the project, but actually you didn't quite abort it. You just went back to the drawing board and have since produced some really good outcomes there.
Yeah, that's correct. We actually, after going back to Australia, we went back to the drawing board and we established, we kept some of the partners that we had, but we established new connections with other partners in Indonesia. And we went back better prepared that time, learning from the mistakes that we made the first time, and actually collected quite some valuable data in our second and third attempts, which eventually resulted in a paper that I've published recently in the journal Cities, where I present some of the insights of the local planning experts in their needs for planning support systems, and I even gathered some actual data, like spatial data sets as well.
And with that, a much better understanding of how you would do things there in future.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so this was your first experience working in the Global South. And so did the lessons that you learned from that help you proceed in the Fanfare project in West Africa a lot more smoothly? I suppose it did, because in a way, the way you've told the story, it was quite successful. You've reached some key milestones and actually kicked some goals or scored some points and won some sets in this journey.
Game, set, match, yes. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I wasn't involved in the setup of the Fanfare project in West Africa, so I can't take all the credit for it, but I think it went very well. And for myself, I went there also with completely different background knowledge and with different expectations and with a clearer view, I think, of how everything goes in the place where I'm going. And this is also thanks to the colleagues that I was working with on this project who had already experienced this. So I went there with the right mindset and I went there with the right approach, I think, to make it work. And it did work. It was actually, even though it wasn't easy, it was a really great experience.
And a really great outcome from the sounds of it. So looking forward to more updates on that as well in the near future.
Yes.
So for those starting off in your field, doing a PhD, going across disciplines, what advice can you offer them?
So I would say go out there and explore. As I said, what I like to do is I like to take a metro line, just take it to the last station and go around, see what I encounter. I think this greatly helps you understanding the real topics that you're working with, and it helps you get inspiration as well in order to how to approach them. And get out there also in terms of talk to people, bounce ideas of each other, and don't get stuck on a plan. That sounds weird as an advice to an urban planner maybe, but I would say don't get stuck on a plan, but seize the opportunities that come your way, because there are many roads that lead to Rome. And I've certainly found myself that I had quite a clear idea of what I was interested in, and I had also an idea of what that would take for me to do, which is study urban planning, which is what I did in the beginning, and I seized. And yet here I am doing things with urban planning. So I think don't get stuck on a certain path, but be open to the opportunity that life throws at you.
It's great advice, which I think makes me also feel very proud that I got the chance to supervise you, and you being my first PhD student. But I also really appreciate your time for coming on the show and speaking to me about what we've been through, but also some of the things that you've been doing since you finished. And yeah, I guess how that ties into the quirky character that you have, and that I always enjoy hanging out with when we go for coffee breaks or when we go out for dinner. Where can people reach you if they want to get in contact? I know you don't do social media much, but is there any way people can look you up and learn more about you?
Yeah, so I'm off social media, but I am thinking of getting back on it again, if only for professional reasons. So watch that space, because I might be back on Twitter and Mastodon soon. But people can always contact me on LinkedIn, because I am on LinkedIn, or just flick me an email.
And more information on that, as well as links to papers, documents, books, whatever you've mentioned, and some of the interesting insights that you provided will be in the show notes for you listeners to look up as well. So do check them out. But Martijn, thank you very much. Famous last words. I always give the last message to my guests. So one message for the listeners to take away from today?
Yeah, thank you. Well, one quote that I saw on the toilet of my parents and which I don't know who to attribute it to, but it's relax, nothing is under control.
Thank you very much. And thank you to you listeners for tuning into this journey with Dr. Martijn Kuller. As mentioned, you can find links to papers, books, avocado lattes, and major tennis matches for your enjoyment in our show notes over at petermbach.com/podcast. If you enjoyed this show and are looking forward to more episodes, please do subscribe or follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you are listening from to be notified of the latest release as soon as it becomes available. I would be incredibly grateful for this as it helps me to reach a broader audience and, who knows, perhaps support more value-focused thinking around coffee choices and a greater use of entire urban metro lines. If you would like to know more about me or my work in general, you can also check out my website at petermbach.com, my YouTube channel, Peter Marcus Bach, that's Marcus with a C, or follow me on Twitter at petermbach or Instagram at petermbach87. If you have feedback or suggestions, or just know someone who has an inspiring story to offer, please feel free to reach out to me on social media. The podcast's intro and outro song is called Bucolia by Bureaucratic. Stay tuned for our next episode and next guest to hear how they are tackling the grand challenges.